When we talk about VBA or macros, we generally think of coding. But today I'd like to share with you the typical folder setup that I use, especially for more complex tools. So essentially, the folder structure that houses the main macro and any supporting files. Now, all my tools, even the simplest that may comprise just one workbook, I place inside its own application or root folder, just like this. For more complex ones with supporting files such as inputs and outputs, I divide the folder into subfolders. So my structure looks something like this. So we have inputs, outputs, templates, and the main macro. Now you might have your own setup that you're happy with, and that's perfectly fine. Two key things for me are try and keep it consistent across all your projects. And secondly, is to try and keep everything all contained within the project folder. So when it comes to inputs, I prefer that all the source files are contained in the input subfolder, so the macro picks them up from there. Now this means that the user will need to either manually copy the files here, or VBA will need to open the file dialog box, and that allows the user to select the file from other locations. But the issue I have with that is once the data is imported, you potentially lose control of what happens to that file, especially if it's owned by another team. They might move it or even delete it. Likewise, if the user downloads the data from an external source system, perhaps via a website, then it may download it to the user's download folder in amongst all other files that have been downloaded and probably unrelated. Also, your company's IT policy might mean that the downloads folder is automatically cleared after a certain period of time. So if the user ever needs that input file in future, perhaps a rerun, investigate an issue, even for audit purposes, that file may be potentially lost and they'll need to hunt around to find it again. So my preference is for the user to manually copy the source files into this input subfolder, and the macro imports it from there. Alternatively, if they prefer to have a file picker, then the macro will provide that, but also copy the file from that location into the inputs folder and then import it from this location. Once the data is imported, the macro will move it to this archive subfolder and append some kind of timestamp, perhaps a reporting date or a processing date, just to make it unique for any subsequent runs. So something like year, month, year, quarter. And with outputs, it's a similar story. I prefer the macro to have control and generate any outputs into this subfolder here. More specifically, I'll create subfolders based on a reporting or processing date, as I mentioned. You could even drill that down, go to client name and so on. Now you could provide a save dialog box for the users to select the output location and even file name, but in my experience it gets a bit messy because the user will not always use the same naming convention. They may accidentally save it to a different location, especially if they go on leave or leave the company or change teams and someone else runs it. They may save it in different locations and it all gets a bit disjointed. If the macro needs to perform batch reporting, then I use this templates folder. In here, I create master templates for each report type. So their structure or layout remains consistent, but what varies is the data set. So for example, for each client, you populate the template, save the workbook, load the next client's data, and repeat. Now I plan to put together some coding videos on how to import data, generate outputs, and even some batch reporting using these templates. So please be on the lookout for those. Now the aim of this structure is to ensure that everything is contained within this parent folder. So if we ever need to run it from somewhere else, you just copy that folder, move it to the other location, and it will work without having to change any code. So this will run on your local C drive, on a network share, so a UNC path, personal OneDrive, and SharePoint. There's a couple of caveats with OneDrive and SharePoint. Firstly, you can't run macros from SharePoint website, so you'll need to create a shortcut. Then you can run the macro from Windows Explorer using that shortcut. Now, the second caveat has to do with creating folders and deleting files on OneDrive and SharePoint. Normally with VBA, to create a folder, you would use the file system object or makedir function. To delete files, you would also use the file system object or the kill function. Unfortunately, neither of those will work with URLs, which means OneDrive and SharePoint. Now, it is possible, however, it's more complicated. So I won't get into it in this video. I'll be putting together a separate video, so please be on the lookout for that. So this is the structure that I generally distribute to users for UAT and production. I do add other folders, but they're for personal use, so I don't distribute them. The first one is documents. So in here, if we're not using any requirements tracking tool, I'll store any business requirements, whether they're formal or informal. I'll put them in this documents folder. Also, any design documents or technical specifications that I produce will also go here. The next one is releases. You could call it versions or whatever you want. If you're using some kind of source control tool, which I highly recommend, then you won't need this. But I've worked in places where for things such as VBA, Excel workbooks, they don't use source control. So I like to keep different versions. Serves two different purposes, really. Sometimes the user may find an issue and think it's been introduced with this new project. I can always go back to previous versions and show that it was always there from before. Also, if they do find an issue and it wasn't in the previous one, it might help us work out what went wrong this time around. Now, in order for that to work, I make sure I store not only the macro, but also a couple of inputs, some outputs, not all of them, because especially if you generate lots of files, and the templates. So I have that whole set for each version in case I need to rerun it. And finally, again, if you're not using a defect tracking tool such as Jira or DevOps, then I'll store any UAT defects and follow-ups and fixes in here in a spreadsheet. I also would add any of my own unit testing. And this is useful, especially if it comes to audit time and they want to know what kind of testing you've done. So that wraps up the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and to be on the lookout for those videos I mentioned. Hopefully I'll get them out to you soon. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.